I've wanted to read Norman Maclean's book, A River Runs Through It, for a long time. And this summer seems a particularly good time to do it, since I think it might be a way for some of us, at least, to not worry so much about the political tension that's out there. I think it's really important for us to keep our cool. So let's try to kill two birds with one stone. Let's start with the first chapter. A river runs through it. In our family, there was no clear line between religion and fly fishing. We lived at the junction of great trout rivers in western Montana, and our father was a Presbyterian minister and a fly fisherman who tied his own flies and taught others. He told us about Christ's disciples being fishermen, and we were left to assume, as my brother and I did, that all first-class fishermen on the Sea of Galilee were fly fishermen, and that John, favorite, was a dry fly fisherman. It is true that one day a week was given over wholly to religion. On Sunday mornings, my brother Paul and I went to Sunday school and then to morning services to hear our father preach, and in the evenings to Christian Endeavor, and afterwards to evening services to hear our father preach again. In between, on Sunday afternoons, we had to study the Westminster Shorter Catechism for an hour and then recite before we could walk the hills with him while he unwound between services. But he never asked us more than the first question in the catechism: what is the chief end of man? And we answered together so one of us could carry on if the other forgot. Man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. This always seemed to satisfy him, as indeed such a beautiful answer should have, and besides, he was anxious to be on the hills, where he could restore his soul and be filled again to overflowing for the evening sermon. His chief way of recharging himself was to recite to us from the sermon that was coming, enriched here and there with selections from the most successful passages of his morning sermon. Even so, in a typical week of our childhood, Paul and I probably received as many hours of instruction in fly fishing as we did in all other spiritual matters. After my brother and I became good fishermen, we realized that our father was not a great fly caster, but he was accurate and stylish, and wore a glove on his casting hand. As he buttoned his glove in preparation to giving us a lesson, he would say, "It is an art that is performed on a 4-count rhythm between 10 and 2 o'clock." As a Scot and a Presbyterian, my father believed that man, by nature, was a mess and had fallen from an original state of grace. Somehow, I early developed the notion that he had done this by falling from a tree. As for my father, I never knew whether he believed in God. He believed God was a mathematician, but he certainly believed God could count, and that only by picking up God's rhythms were we able to regain power and beauty. Unlike many Presbyterians, he often used the word beautiful. After he buttoned his glove, he would hold his rod straight out in front of him where it trembled with the beating of his heart, and although it was 8.5 feet long, it weighed only 4.5 ounces. It was made of split bamboo cane from far off Bay of Tonkin. It was wrapped with red and blue silk thread, and the wrappings were carefully spaced to make the delicate rod powerful, but not so stiff it could not tremble. Always it was to be called a rod. If anyone called it a pole, my father looked at him as a sergeant in the United States Marines would look at a recruit who had just called a rifle a gun. My brother and I would have preferred to start learning how to fish by going out and catching a few, omitting entirely anything difficult or technical in the way of preparation that would take away from the fun. But it wasn't by way of fun that we were introduced to our father's art. If our father had had his say, nobody who did not know how to fish would be allowed to disgrace a fish by catching him. So you too will have to approach the art, Marine and Presbyterian style, and if you have never picked up a fly rod before, you will soon find it factually and theologically true that man by nature is a damn mess. The 4.5 ounce thing in silk Wrappings that trembles with the underskin motions of the flesh becomes a stick without brains, refusing anything simple that is wanted of it. All that a rod has to do is lift the line, the leader, and the fly off the water, give them a good toss over the head, and then shoot them forward so they'll land in the water without a splash in the following order: fly, transparent leader, and then the line. Otherwise, a fish will see the fly as a fake and be gone. Of course, there are special casts that anyone could predict would be difficult, and they require artistry. Casts where the line can't go over the fisherman's head because cliffs or trees are immediately behind. Sideways cast to get the fly under overhanging willows and so on. But what's remarkable about just a straight cast, just picking up a rod with line on it and tossing the line across the river, well, until man is redeemed, he will always take a fly rod too far back, just as natural man always overswings with an axe or a golf club and loses all his power somewhere in the air. Only with the rod it's worse, because the fly often comes so far back it gets caught behind in a bush or rock. When my father said it was an art that ended at 2 o'clock, he often added closer to 12 than 2, meaning that the rod should be taken back only slightly farther than overhead, straight overhead being 12 o'clock. Then, since it is natural for man to try to attain power without recovering grace, he whips the line back and forth, making it whistle each way, and sometimes even snapping off the fly from the leader. But the power that was going to transport the little fly across the river somehow gets diverted into building a bird's nest of line, leader, and fly that falls out of the air into the water about 10 feet in front of the fisherman. If, though, he pictures the round trip of the line, transparent leader, and fly from the time they leave the water until their return, they're easier to cast. They naturally come off the water, heavy line first and in front, and light transparent leader and fly trailing behind. But as they pass overhead, they have to have a little beat of time so the light transparent leader and fly can catch up to the heavy line, now starting forward and again fall behind it. Otherwise, the line starting on its return trip will collide with the leader and fly still on their way up, and the mess will be the bird's nest that splashes into the water 10 feet in front of the fisherman. Almost the moment, however, that the forward order of the line, leader, and fly is reestablished, it has to be reversed, because the fly and transparent leader must be ahead of the heavy line when they settle on the water. If what the fish sees is highly visible line, what the fisherman will see, fisherman will see, are departing black darts. He might as well start for the next hole. High overhead, then, on the forward cast, about 10 o'clock, the fisherman checks again. The 4 count rhythm, of course, is functional. The 1 count takes the line, leader, and fly off the water. The 2 count tosses them seemingly straight into the sky. The 3 count was my father's way of saying that at the top of the leader and fly have to be given a little beat of time to get behind the line as it's starting forward. The 4 count means put on the power and throw the line into the rod until you reach 10 o'clock. Then check cast, let the fly and leader get ahead of the line and coast to a soft and perfect landing. Power comes not from power everywhere, but from knowing where to put it on. Remember, as my father kept saying, it is an art that is performed on a 4 count rhythm between 10 and 2 o'clock. My father was very sure about certain matters pertaining to the universe. To him, all good things, trout as well as eternal salvation, come by grace, and grace comes by art, and art does not come easy. So my brother and I learned to cast Presbyterian style on a metronome. It was mother's metronome, which father had taken from the top of the piano in town. She would occasionally peer down to the dock from the front porch of the cabin, wondering nervously whether her metronome could float if it had to. When she became so overwrought that she thumped down the dock to reclaim it, my father would clap out the 4 count rhythm as he cupped his hands, with his cupped hands. Eventually, he introduced us to literature on the subject. He tried always to say something stylish as he buttoned the glove on his casting hand. Isaac Walton, he told us when my brother was 13 or 14, is not a respectable writer. He was an Episcopalian and a bait fisherman. Although Paul was 3 years younger than I was, he was already far ahead of me in anything relating to fishing, and it was he who first found a copy of The Complete Angler and reported back to me, the bastard doesn't even know how to spell complete. Besides, he has songs to sing to dairymaids. I borrowed his copy and reported back to him, some of those songs are pretty good. He said, whoever saw a dairymaid on the Big Blackfoot River? I would like, he said, to get him for a day's fishing on the Big Blackfoot with a bet on the side. The boy was very angry, and there was never been a doubt in my mind that the boy would have taken the Episcopalian's money. When you're in your teens, maybe throughout your life, being 3 years older than your brother often makes you feel he is a boy. However, I knew already that he was going to be a master with a rod. He had those extra things besides fine training, genius, luck, and plenty of self-confidence. Even at this age, he liked to bet on himself against anybody who would fish with him, including me, his older brother. It was sometimes funny and sometimes not so funny to see a boy always wanting to bet on himself and almost sure to win. Although I was 3 years older, I did not yet feel old enough to bet. Betting, I assumed, was for men who wore straw hats on the backs of their heads, so I was confused and embarrassed the first couple of times. He asked me if I didn't want a small bet on the side just to make things interesting. The third time he asked me must have made me angry because he never again spoke to me about money, not even about borrowing a few dollars when he was having real money problems. We had to be very careful in dealing with each other. I often thought of him as a boy, but I never could treat him that way. He was never my kid brother. He was a master of an art. He did not want any big brother to advise, any big brother advice or money or help, and in the end, I could not help him. Since one of the earliest things brothers try to find out is how they differ from each other, one of the things I remember longest about Paul is this business about his liking to bet. He would go to country fairs to pretend that he was betting on the horses, like the men, except that no betting booths would take his bets because they were too small and he was too young. When his bets were refused, he would say, as he said of Isaac Walton and any other he took as a rival, I'd like to get that bastard on the Blackfoot for a day with a bet on the side. By the time he was in his early 20s, he was in the big stud poker games. Circumstances, too, helped to widen our differences. The draft of World War I immediately left the woods short of men. So at 15, I started working for the United States Forest Service, and for many summers afterwards, I worked in the woods, either with the Forest Service or in logging camps. I liked the woods and I liked work, but for a good many summers, I didn't do much fishing. Paul was too young to swing an axe or pull a saw all day, and besides, he had decided this early that he had two major purposes in life: to fish and not to work, at least not allow work to interfere with fishing. In his teens, then, he got a summer job as a lifeguard at the municipal swimming pool. So in the early evenings, he could go fishing, and during the days, he could look over girls in bathing suits and date them up for the late evenings. When it came to choosing a profession, it became a reporter. On a Montana paper, early then, he had come close to realizing life's purposes, which did not conflict in his mind from those given in answer to the first question in the Westminster Catechism. Undoubtedly, our differences would not have seemed so great if we had not been such a close family. Painted on one side of our Sunday school wall were the words, God is love. We always assumed that these three words were spoken directly to the four of us in our family and had no reference to the world outside, which my brother and I soon discovered was full of bastards, the number increasing rapidly the further one gets from Missoula, Montana. We also held in common the knowledge that we were tough. This knowledge increased with age, at least until we were well into our 20s and probably longer, possibly much longer. but our differences showed even in our toughness. I was tough by being the product of tough establishments, the United States Forest Service and logging camps. Paul was tough by thinking he was tougher than any establishment. My mother and I watched horrified morning after morning while the Scottish minister tried to make his small child eat oatmeal. My father was also horrified, at first because a child of his own bowels would not eat God's oats. And as the days went by, because his wee child proved tougher than he was, as the minister raged, the child bowed his head over the food and folded his hands as if his father were saying grace. The child gave only one side of his own great anger. His lips became swollen. The hotter my father got, the colder the porridge, until finally my father burned out. Each of us then not only thought he was tough, he knew the other one had the same opinion of himself. Paul knew that I had already been foreman of forest fire crews and that if he worked for me and drank on the job as he did when he was reporting, I would tell him to go to camp, get his time slip, and keep on down the trail. I knew that there was about as much chance of his fighting fire as of his eating oatmeal. We held in common one major theory about street fighting. If it looks like a fight is coming, get in the first punch. We both thought that most bastards aren't so tough as they talk. Even bastards who look as well as talk tough. If suddenly they feel a few teeth loose, they'll rub their mouths, look at the blood on their hands, and offer to buy a drink for the house. Even if they still feel like fighting, as my brother said, you are one big punch ahead when the fight starts. There is just one trouble with this theory. It is only statistically true. Every once in a while, you run into some guy who likes to fight as much as you do and is better at it. If you start off by loosening a few of his teeth, he may try to kill you. I suppose it was inevitable that my brother and I would get into one big fight, which also would be the last one. When it came, given our theories about street fightings, it was like the battle hymn, terrible and swift. There are parts of it I did not see. I did not see our mother walk between us to try to stop us. She was short and wore glasses, and even with them on, did not have good vision. She had never seen a fight before or had any notion of how you can get hurt by becoming mixed up in one. Evidently, she just walked between her sons. The first I saw of her was the gray top of her head, the hair tied in a big knot with a big comb in it. But what was most noticeable was that her head was so close to Paul, I couldn't get a good punch at him. Then I didn't see her anymore. The fight seemed suddenly to stop itself. She was laying on the floor between us. Then we both began to cry and fight in a rage, each one shouting, "You son of a bitch, you knocked my mother down." She got off the floor and, blind without her glasses, staggered in circles between us, saying without recognizing which one she was addressing, "No, it wasn't you. I just slipped and fell." So this was the only time we ever fought. Perhaps we always wondered which of us was tougher, but if boyhood questions aren't answered before a certain point in time, they can't ever be answered again. So we returned to being gracious to each other, as the wall suggested that we should be. We also felt that the woods and rivers were gracious to us when we walked together beside them. It is true that we didn't often fish together anymore. We were both in our early 30s now, and now, from here on, is the summer of 1937. My father had retired, and he and mother were living in Missoula, our old hometown, and Paul was a reporter in Helena, the state capital. I had gone off and got married, to use my brother's description of this event in my life. At that moment, I was living with my wife's family in the little town of Wolf Creek. But since Wolf Creek is only 40 miles from Helena, we still saw each other from time to time, which meant, of course, fishing now and then together. In fact, the reason I had come to Helena now was to see him about fishing. Fact also is that my mother-in-law had asked me to. I wasn't happy, but I was fairly sure my brother would finally say yes. He had never said plain no to me, and he loved my mother-in-law and my wife, whom he included in the sign on the wall, even though he could never understand what had come over me that would explain why marriage had ever crossed my mind. I ran into him in front of the Montana Club, which was built by rich gold miners, supposedly on the spot where gold was discovered in Last Chance Gulch. Although it was only 10 o'clock in the morning, I had a hunch he was about to buy a drink. I had news to give him before I could ask the question. After I gave him the news, my brother said, "He'll be just as welcome as a dose of clap." I said to my brother, "Go easy on him. He's my brother-in-law." My brother said, "I won't fish with him. He comes from the West Coast and he fishes with worms." I said, "Cut it out. You know he was born and brought up in Montana. He just works on the West Coast. And now he's coming back for a vacation and writes his mother he wants to fish with us, especially with you especially." My brother said, "Practically everyone on the West Coast, everybody on the West Coast was born in the Rocky Mountains where they failed as fly fishermen. So they migrated to the West Coast and became lawyers, certified public accountants, presidents of airplane companies, gamblers, or Mormon missionaries." I wasn't sure he was about to buy a drink, but he had already had one. We stood looking at each other, not liking anything that was happening, but watching that we didn't go too far in disagreeing. Actually, though, we weren't very far apart about my brother-in-law. In some ways, I liked him even less than Paul did. And it's no pleasure to see your wife's face on somebody you don't like. Besides, my brother said he's a bait fisherman. All those Montana boys on the West Coast sit around the bars at night and lie to each other about their frontier childhood when they were hunters, trappers, and fly fishermen. When they come home, they don't even kiss their mothers on the front porch because they're in the back garden with a red, with a red Hills Brothers coffee can digging for angleworms. My brother and his editor wrote most of the Helena paper. The editor was one of the last small town editors in the classic school of personal invective. He started drinking early in the morning so he wouldn't feel sorry for anyone during the day, and he and my brother admired each other greatly. The rest of the town feared them, especially because they wrote well, and in a hostile world, both of them needed to be loved by their families and were. I could tell by now that I was keeping my brother from having a drink, and sure enough, he said, "Let's go in and hoist one." I made the mistake of sounding as if I were afraid to come out and criticize his morals. I said, "I'm sorry, Paul, but it's too early in the morning for me to start drinking." Having to say something else quick, I didn't improve my morals, at least not in my own eyes, by adding, "Florence asked me to ask you." I hated to pass the buck to my mother-in-law. One reason Paul and I loved her was that she looked like our father. Both of them were Scots by way of Canada. Both of them had blue eyes and sandy hair, which was red when they were younger, and both of them pronounced about the way Canadians do, who, if they were poets, would rhyme with snoot. I couldn't feel too sorry, though, because it really was she who had put me up to asking, and she had begun confusing me by mixing a certain amount of truth with her flattery. "Although I know nothing about fishing," she said, "I know Paul is the best fisherman anywhere." This was a complicated statement. She knew how to clean fish when the men forgot to, and she knew how to cook them, and most important, she knew always to peer into the fisherman's basket and exclaim, "My, my." So she knew all that any woman of her time knew about fishing, although it's also true that she knew absolutely nothing about fishing. "I would like very much to think of Neil with him and you," she concluded, no doubt hoping that we would improve his morals even more than his casting. In our town, Paul and I were known as the preacher's kids, and most mothers refrained from pointing us out to their children. But to this Scottish woman, we were the pastor's sons. And besides, as fly fishermen, we would be waist deep in cold water all day, where immorality is faced with some real, but as it turned out, not insurmountable problems. "Poor boy," she said, adding as many Scottish R's as she could to poor. More than most mothers, Scottish mothers have had to accustom themselves to migration and sin, and to them all sons were prodigal and welcome home. Scotsmen, however, are much more reserved about welcoming returning male relatives and do so largely under the powerful influence of their women. "Sure, I will," Paul said, if Florence wants me to, and I knew that, having given his word, I would never get another kick from him. Let's have a drink, I said. At 10:15 a.m., I paid for it. Just before 10:15, I told him Neil was coming to Wolf Creek day after tomorrow, and that the day following we were to go fishing on the Elkhorn. It's to be a family picnic, I told him. That's fine, he said. The Elkhorn is a small stream running into the Missouri, and Paul and I were big fishermen, looking with contempt upon the husbands of wives who have to say, "We like the little ones. They make best eating." But the Elkhorn has many special features, including some giant brown trout that work their way up from the Missouri. Although the Elkhorn was our favorite small stream, Paul said after paying for our second drink, "I don't have to be on the beat tomorrow until evening. So what about just you and me taking the day off and fishing the big river before we have to go on the picnic?" Paul and I fished a good many big rivers, but when one of us referred to the big river, the other knew it was the Big Blackfoot. It isn't the biggest river we fish, but it is the most powerful, and per pound, so are its fish. They run straight and hard. On a map or from an airplane, it's almost a straight line running due west from its headwaters at Rogers Pass on the Continental Divide to Bonner, Montana, where it empties into the South Fork of the Clark Fork of the Columbia. It runs hard all the way. Near its headwaters on the Continental Divide, there is a mine with a thermometer that stopped at 69.7 degrees below zero, the lowest temperature ever officially recorded in the United States, Alaska omitted. And from its headwaters to its mouth, it was manufactured by glaciers. The first 65 miles of it are smashed against the southern wall of its valley by glaciers that moved in from the north, scarifying the earth. Its lower 25 miles were made overnight when the great glacial lake covering northwestern Montana and northern Idaho broke its ice dam and spread the remains of Montana and Idaho mountains over hundreds of miles of the plains of eastern Washington. It was the biggest flood in the world for which there is geologic evidence. It was so vast a geological event that the mind of man could only conceive of it, but not prove it until photographs could be taken from Earth's satellites. The straight line on the map also suggests its glacial origins. It has no meandering valley, and its few farms are mostly on the southern tributaries, which were not ripped up by the glaciers. Instead of opening into a wide floodplain near its mouth, the valley, which was cut overnight by a disappearing lake when the great ice dam melted, gets narrower and narrower until the only way a river, an old logging railroad, and an automobile road can fit into it is for two of them to take to the mountainsides. It is a tough place for a trout to live. The river roars and the water is too fast to let algae grow on the rocks for feed, so there's no fat on the fish, which must hold most trout records for high jumping. Besides, it is a river we knew best. My brother and I had fished the Big Blackfoot since nearly the beginning of the century, my father before then. We regarded it as a family river, as part of us, and I surrendered it now, only with great reluctance, to dude ranches, the unselected inhabitants of Great Falls, and the Moorish invaders from California. Early next morning, Paul picked me up in Wolf Creek, and we drove across Rogers Pass, where the thermometer is that stuck at 3/10 of a degree short of 70 below. As usual, especially if it were early in the morning, we sat silently respectful until we passed the big divide, but started talking the moment we thought we were draining into another ocean. Paul nearly always had a story to tell in which he was the leading character, but not the hero. He told us Continental Divide stories in a seemingly light-hearted, slightly poetical mood, such as reporters often use in writing human interest stories. But if the mood were removed, his stories would appear as something about him that would not meet the approval of his family, and that I would probably find out about in time anyway. He also must have felt honor bound to tell me that he lived other lives, even if he presented them to me as puzzles in the form of funny stories. Often I did not know what I had been told about him as we crossed the divide between our two worlds. He began, and it's been a couple of weeks since I fished the Blackfoot. At the beginning, his story sounded like factual reporting. He had fished alone, and the fishing had not been much good, so he had to fish until evening to get his limit. Since he was returning directly to Helena, he was driving up Nevada Creek along an old dirt road that followed section lines and turned at right angles at section corners. It was moonlight. He was tired and feeling in need of a friend to keep him awake, when suddenly a jackrabbit jumped onto the road and started running with the headlights. I didn't push him too hard, he said, because I didn't want to lose a friend. He drove, he said, with his head outside the window so he could feel close to the rabbit. With his head in the moonlight, his account took on poetic touches. The vague world of moonlight was pierced by the intense white triangle from the headlights. In the center of the penetrating isosceles was the jackrabbit, which, except for the length of his jumps, had become a snowshoe rabbit. The phosphorescent jackrabbit was doing his best to keep in the center of the isosceles, but was afraid he was losing ground. And when he looked back to check, his eyes shone with whites and blues gathered up from the universe. My brother said, I don't know how to explain what happened next, but there was a right angle turn in this section line road, and the rabbit saw it, and I didn't. Later, he happened to mention that it cost him $175 to have his car fixed, and in 1937, you can almost get a car rebuilt for $175. Of course, he never mentioned that, although he did not drink when he fished. He always started drinking when he finished. I rode part of the way down the Blackfoot wondering whether I had been told a little human interest story with hard luck turned into humor, or whether I had been told he had taken too many drinks and smashed the hell out of the front end of his car. Since it was no great thing either way, I finally decided to forget it. And as you see, I didn't. I did, though, start thinking about the canyon where we were going to fish. The canyon above the old Clearwater Bridge is where the Blackfoot roars loudest. The backbone of a mountain would not break, so the mountain compresses the already powerful river into sound and spray before letting it pass. Here, of course, the road leaves the river. There is no place in the canyon for an Indian trail, even in 1806 when Lewis left Clark to come up the Blackfoot. He skirted the canyon by a safe margin. It is no place for small fish or small fishermen. Even the roar adds power to the fish, or at least intimidates the fishermen. When we fished the canyon, we fished on the same side of it for the simple reason that there's no place in the canyon to wade across. I could hear Paul start to pass me to get to the hole above, and when I realized I didn't hear him anymore, I knew he had stopped to watch me. Although I have never pretended to be a great fisherman, it was always important to me that I was a fisherman and looked like one, especially when fishing with my brother. Even before the silence continued, I knew that I wasn't looking like much of anything. Although I have a warm personal feeling for the canyon, it's not an ideal place for me to fish. It puts a premium upon being able to cast for distance, and yet most of the time there are cliffs or trees right behind the fisherman, so he has to keep all his line in front of him. It's like a baseball pitcher being deprived of his windup, and it forces a fly fisherman into what's called a roll cast, a hard cast that I never mastered. The fisherman has to work enough line into his cast to get distance without throwing any line behind him. And then he has to develop enough power from a short arc to shoot it out across the water. He starts accumulating the extra amount of line for the long cast by retrieving his last cast so slowly that an unusual amount of line stays in the water, and what is out of it forms a slack semi-loop. The loop is enlarged by raising the casting arm straight up and cocking the wrist until it points to 130. There, then, is a lot of line in front of the fisherman, but it takes about everything he has to get it high in the air and out over the water so that the fly and leader settle ahead of the line. The arm is a piston, the wrist is a revolver that uncocks, and even the body gets behind the punch. Important, too, is the fact that the extra amount of line remaining in the water until the last moment gives a semi-solid bottom to the cast. It is a little like a rattlesnake striking with a good piece of his tail on the ground as something to strike from. All this is easy for a rattlesnake, but it has always been hard for me. Paul knew how I felt about my fishing and was careful not to seem superior by offering advice, but he had watched so long that he couldn't leave now without saying something. Finally, he said, "The fish are out further." Probably fearing he had just put strain on family relations, he quickly added, "Just a little farther." I reeled in my line slowly, not looking behind, so as not to see him. Maybe he was sorry he had spoken, but having said what he said, he had to say something more. Instead of retrieving the line straight toward you, bring it in on a diagonal from the downstream side. The diagonal will give you a more resistant base to your loop so you can put more power into your forward cast and get a little more distance. Then he acted as if he hadn't said anything, and I acted as if I hadn't heard it. But as soon as he left, which was immediately, I started retrieving my line on a diagonal, and it helped. The moment I felt I was getting a little more distance, I ran for a fresh hole to make a fresh start in life. It was a beautiful stretch of water, either to a fisherman or a photographer, although each would have focused his equipment on a different point. It was a barely submerged waterfall. The reef of rock was about 2 feet under the water, so the whole river rose in one wave, shook itself into spray, and then fell back on itself and turned blue. After it recovered from the shock, it came back to see how it had fallen. No fish could live out there where the river exploded into the colors and curves that would attract photographers. The fish were in the slow backwash, right in the dirty foam, with the dirt being one of the chief attractions. Part of the speckles would be pollen from pine trees, but most of the dirt was edible insect life that had not survived the waterfall. I studied the situation. Although maybe I had just added there 3 feet to my roll cast, I still had to do a lot of thinking before casting to compensate for some of my other shortcomings. But I felt I had already made the right beginning. I had already figured out where the big fish would be and why. Then an odd thing happened. I saw him. A black back rose and sank in the foam. In fact, I imagine I saw spines on his dorsal fin till I said to myself, God, he couldn't be so big you could see his fins. I even added, you wouldn't even have seen the fish in all that foam if you hadn't first thought he would be there. But I couldn't shake the conviction that I'd seen the black back of a big fish, because as someone often forced to think, I know that often I would not see a thing unless I thought of it first. Seeing the fish that I first thought would be there led me to wondering which way he would be pointing in the river. Remember when you make the first cast, I thought, that you saw him in the backwash where the water is circling upstream, so he will be looking downstream, not upstream, as he would be if he were in the main current. I was led by association to the question of what fly I would cast, and to the conclusion that it had better be a large fly, a number 4 or 6. I was going after the big hump in the foam. From the fly, I went to the other end of the cast and asked myself where the hell I was going to cast from. There were only gigantic rocks at this waterfall, so I picked one of the biggest, saw how I could crawl up it, and knew from that added height I would get added distance. But then I had to ask myself, how the hell am I going to land the fish if I hook him while I'm standing up there? So I had to pick a smaller rock, which would shorten my distance, but would let me slide down it with a rod in my hand and a big fish on. I was gradually approaching the question all river fishermen should ask before they make the first cast. If I hook a big one, where the hell can I land him? One great thing about fly fishing is that after a while, nothing exists of the world but thoughts about fly fishing. It is also interesting that thoughts about fishing are often carried on in dialogue from where hope and fear, or many times two fears, try to outweigh each other. One fear looked down the shoreline and said to me, a third person distinct from the two fears, there's nothing but rocks for 30 yards. But don't get scared and try to land them before you get all the way down to the first sandbar. The second fear said, It's 40, not 30 yards to the first sandbar, and the weather's been warm and the fish's mouth will be soft and to work off the hook if you try to fight him 40 yards downriver. It's not good, but it will be best to try to land him on a rock that is closer. The first fear said, there's a big rock in the river that you'll have to take him past before you land him. But if you hold the line tight enough on him and keep him this side of the rock, you'll probably lose him. The second fear said, but if you let him get on the far side of the rock, the line will get caught under it and you will be sure to lose him. And that's how you know when you've thought too much. When you become a dialogue between you'll probably lose and you're sure to lose. That's a good one. But I hadn't entirely quit thinking, although I did switch subjects. It's not in the book, yet it is human enough to spend a moment before casting and trying to imagine what the fish is thinking, even if one of its eggs is as big as its brain, and even if, when you swim underwater, it is hard to imagine that a fish has anything to think about. Still, I could never be talked into believing that all a fish knows is hunger and fear. I've tried to feel nothing but hunger and fear, and don't see how a fish could ever grow to 6 inches if that were all he ever felt. In fact, I go so far sometimes as to imagine that a fish thinks pretty thoughts. Before I made the cast, I imagined the fish with the black back lying cool in the carbonated water full of bubbles from the waterfalls. He was looking downstream and watching the foam with food in it, but backing upstream like a floating cafeteria coming to wait on its customers. And he probably was imagining that the speckled foam was eggnog with nutmeg sprinkled on it. And when the whites of eggs separated, he saw what was on shore. Probably said to himself, what a lucky son of a bitch I am that this guy and not his brother is about to fish this hole. I thought all these thoughts and some besides that proved of no value, and then I cast and I caught him. I kept cool until I tried to take the hook out of his mouth. He was lying covered with sand on the little bar where I had landed him. His gills opened with his penultimate size, then suddenly he stood up on his head in the sand and hit me with his tail, and the sand flew. Slowly at first my hands began to shake, and although I thought they made a miserable sight, I couldn't stop them. Finally, I managed to open the large blade to my knife, which several times slid off his skull before it went through his brain. Even when I bent him, he was way too long for my basket, so the tail stuck out. There were black spots on him that looked like crustaceans. He seemed oceanic, including barnacles. When I passed my brother at the next hole, I saw him study the tail and slowly remove. It's good. Slowly remove his hat, and not out of respect to my prowess as a fisherman. I had a fish, so I sat down to watch a fisherman. He took his cigarettes and matches from his shirt pocket and put them in his hat, pulled his hat down tight so it wouldn't leak. Then he unstrapped his fish basket and hung it on the edge of his shoulder where he could get rid of it quick, should the water get too big for him. If he studied the situation, it didn't take any separate time to do it. He jumped off a rock into the swirl and swam for a chunk of cliff that had dropped into the river and parted it. He swam in his clothes, with only his left arm in his right hand. He held his rod high, and sometimes all I could see was the basket and rod. When the basket filled with water, sometimes all I could see was the rod. The current smashed him into the chunk of cliff, and it must have hurt, but he had enough strength remaining in his left fingers to hang to a crevice, or he would have been swept into the blue below. Then he still had to climb to the top of the rock with his left fingers and his right elbow, which he used like a prospector's pick. When he finally stood on top, his clothes looked hydraulic, as if they were running off him. Once he quit wobbling, he shook himself duck-like fashion, with his feet spread apart, his body lowered and his head flopping. Then he steadied himself and began to cast, and the whole world turned to water. Below him was the multitudinous river, and where the rock had parted it had parted around him, big grain vapor rose. The many molecules of water left in the wake of his line made momentary loops of gossamer, disappearing so rapidly in the rising big grain vapor that they had to be retained in memory to be visualized as loops. The spray emanating from him was finer grained still and enclosed him in a halo of himself. The halo of himself was always there and always disappearing, as if he were candlelight, flickering about 3 inches above himself. The images of himself and his line kept disappearing into the rising vapors of the river, which continually circled to the tops of the cliffs, where after becoming a wreath in the wind, they became rays of the sun. The river above and below his rock was all big rainbow water, and he would cast hard and low upstream, skimming the water with his fly, but never letting it touch. Then he would pivot, reverse his line in a great oval above his head, and drive his line low and hard downstream, again skimming the water with his fly. He would complete this grand circle 4 or 5 times, creating an immensity of motion which culminated in nothing if you did not know, even if you could not see, that now somewhere out there a small fly was washing itself on a wave. Shockingly, immensity would return as the big black foot and the air above it became iridescent with the arched sides of a great rainbow. He called this shadow casting, and frankly, I don't know whether to believe the theory behind it, that the fish are alerted by the shadows of flies passing over the water by the first cast, so hit the fly the moment it touches the water. It is more or less the working up an appetite theory. Almost too fancy to be true. But then every fine fisherman has a few fancy stunts that work for him and for almost no one else. Shadow casting never worked for me, but maybe I never had the strength of arm and wrist to keep the line circling over the water until a fish imagined a hatch of flies was out. My brother's wet clothes made it easy to see his strength. Most great casters I've known were big men over 6 feet. The added height certainly making it easier, get more line in the air and in a bigger arc. My brother was only 5 feet 10, but he had fished so many years his body had become partly shaped by his casting. He was 32 now, at the height of his power, and he could put all his body and soul into a 4.5 ounce magic totem pole. Long ago he had gone far beyond my father's wrist casting, although his right wrist was always so important that it had become larger than his left. His right arm, which our father had kept tied to the side to emphasize the wrist, shot out of his shirt as if it were engineered, and it, too, was larger than his left arm. His wet shirt bulged and came unbuttoned with his pivoting shoulders and hips. It was also not hard to see why he was a street fighter, especially since he was committed to getting in the first punch with his right hand. Rhythm was just as important as color, and just as street fighters, oops, just as complicated. It was one rhythm superimposed upon another, our father's four count rhythm of the line and wrist being still the bass rhythm. But superimposed upon it was the piston, 2 counts of his arm, and the long overriding 4 count of the completed figure eight of his reversed loop. The canyon was glorified by rhythms and colors. I heard voices behind me, and a man and his wife came down the trail, each carrying a rod. But probably they weren't going to do much fishing. Probably they intended nothing much more than to enjoy being out of doors with each other. And on the other side, to pick enough huckleberries for a pie. In those days, there was little in the way of rugged sports clothes for women, and she was a big, rugged woman and wore regular men's bib overalls, and her motherly breast bulged out of the bib. She was the first to see my brother pivoting on the top of his cliff. To her, he must have looked something like a trick rope artist at a rodeo, doing everything except jumping in and out of his loops. She kept watching while groping behind her to smooth out some pine needles to sit on. My, she said. Her husband stopped and stood and said, Jesus. Every now and then he said, Jesus, each time his wife nodded. She was one of America's mothers who never dreamed of using profanity themselves, but enjoy their husbands and later come to need it like cigar smoke. I started to make for the next hole. Oh no, she said. You're going to wait, aren't you, until he comes to shore so you can see his big fish? No, I answered. I'd rather remember the molecules. She obviously thought I was crazy, so I added, I'll see his fish later. And to make any sense for her, I had to add, he's my brother. As I kept going, the middle of my back told me that I was being viewed from the rear both as quite a guy, because I was his brother, and also as a little bit nutty because I was molecular. Since our fish were big enough to deserve a few drinks and quite a bit of talk afterwards, we were late in getting back to Helena. On the way, Paul asked, why not stay overnight with me and go down to Wolf Creek in the morning? He added that he himself had to be out for the evening, but could be back soon after midnight. I learned later it must have been around 2 o'clock in the morning when I heard the thing that was ringing, and I ascended through river mists and molecules until I awoke, reaching the telephone. The telephone had a voice on it which asked, are you Paul's brother? I asked, what's wrong? And the voice said, I want you to see him. Thinking we had poor connections, I banged the phone. Who are you? I asked. He said, I'm the desk sergeant who wants you to see his brother, who wants you to see your brother. The checkbook was still in my hand when I reached the jail. The desk sergeant frowned and said, no, you don't have to post bond for him. He covers the police beat and has friends here. All you have to do is look at him and take him home. Then he added, but we'll have to come back. A guy is going to sue him. Maybe two guys are. Not wanting to see him without a notion of what I might see, I kept repeating, what's wrong? When the desk sergeant thought it was time, he told me, he hit a guy and the guy is missing a couple of teeth and is all cut up. I asked, what's the second guy suing him for? For breaking dishes, also a table, the sergeant said. The second guy owns the restaurant and the guy who got hit lit on one of the tables. By now, I was ready to see my brother, but it was becoming clear that the sergeant had called me to the situation to have a talk. He said, you're picking him up too much lately. He's drinking too much. I had already heard more than I wanted. Maybe one of our ultimate troubles was that I never wanted to hear too much about my brother. The sergeant finished what he had to say by finally telling me what he really wanted to say. Besides, he's behind in the big stud poker game at Hot Springs. It's not healthy to be behind in the big game at Hot Springs. You and your brother think you're tough because you because you're street fighters. At Hot Springs, they don't play any child games like fist fighting. At Hot Springs, it's the big stud poker game and all that goes with it. I was confused from trying to rise suddenly from molecules of sleep to an understanding of what I did not want to understand. I said, let's begin again. Why is he here and is he hurt? The sergeant said, he's not hurt, just sick. He drinks too much. At Hot Springs, they don't drink too much. I said to the sergeant, let's go on. Why is he here? According to the sergeant's report to me, Paul and his girl had gone into Weiss's restaurant for a midnight sandwich, popular place at midnight since it had booths in the rear where you and your girlfriend could sit and draw the curtains. The girl, the sergeant said, was that half-breed Indian girl he goes with, the one, he added as if to implicate me. Paul and his girl were evidently looking for an empty booth when a guy in a booth they had passed stuck his head out of the curtain and yelled, Wahoo! Paul hit the head, separating the head from two teeth and knocking the body back on the table, which overturned, cutting the guy and his girl with broken dishes. The sergeant said, the guy said to me, Jesus, all I meant is that it's funny to go out with an Indian. It was just a joke. I said to the sergeant, it's not very funny. And the sergeant said, no, not very funny, but it's going to cost your brother a lot of money and time to get out of it. What really isn't funny is that he's behind in the game at Hot Springs. Can you help him straighten out? I don't know what to do, I confessed to the sergeant. I know what you mean, the sergeant confessed to me. Desk sergeants at this time were still Irish. I have a young brother, he said, who's a wonderful kid, but he's always in trouble. He's what we call Black Irish. What do you do to help him? I asked after a long pause. He said, I take him fishing. And when that doesn't work, I asked, You better go and see your own brother, he answered. Wanting to see him in perspective, when I saw him, I stood still until I could see again the woman in bib overalls marveling at his shadow casting. Then I opened the door to the room where they toss the drunks until they can walk a crack in the floor. His girl is with him, the sergeant said. He was standing in front of a window, but he could not have been looking out of it because there was a heavy screen between the bars, and he could not have seen me because his enlarged casting hand was over his face. Were it not for the lasting compassion I felt for his hand, I might have doubted afterwards that I had seen him. His girl was sitting on the floor at his feet. When her black hair glistened, she was one of my favorite women. Her mother was a Northern Cheyenne. So when her black hair glistened, she was handsome, more Algonquian and Roman-like than Mongolian in profile, and very warlike, especially after a few drinks. At least one of her great-grandmothers had been with the Northern Cheyenne when the Sioux destroyed General Custer in the 7th Cavalry, and since it was the Cheyennes who were camped on the Little Bighorn just opposite to the hill they were about to immortalize, the Cheyenne squaws were among the first to work the field over after the battle. At least one of her ancestors then had spent a late afternoon happily cutting off the testicles of the 7th Cavalry and cutting off and occurring before death. This paleface who had stuck his head out of the booth in Weiss's cafe and yelled Wahoo was lucky to be missing only 2 teeth. Even I couldn't walk down the street beside her without her getting me into trouble. She liked to hold Paul with one arm and me with the other and walk down Last Chance Gulch on Saturday night, forcing people into the gutter to get around us. And when they wouldn't give up the sidewalk, she would shove Paul or me into them. You didn't have to go very far down Last Chance Gulch on Saturday night shoving people into the gutter before you were into a hell of a big fight. But she always felt she had a disappointing evening and had not been appreciated if the guy who took her out didn't get into a big fight over her. When her hair glistened, though, she was worth it. She was one of the most beautiful dancers I've ever seen. She made her partner feel as if he were about to be left behind or already had been. It is a strange and wonderful and somewhat embarrassing feeling to build someone in your arms, to hold someone in your arms who's trying to detach you from the earth, and you aren't good enough to follow her. I called her Mona Zeta, the name of the beautiful daughter of the Cheyenne chief Little Rock. At first, she didn't particularly care for the name, which means the young grass that shoots in the spring. But after I explained to her that Mona Zeta was supposed to have had an illegitimate son by General George Armstrong Custer, she took to the name like a duck to water. Looking down on her now, I could see only the spread of her hair on her shoulders and the spread of her legs on the floor. Her hair did not glisten, and I had never seen her legs when they were just things lying on the floor. Knowing that I was looking down on her, she struggled to get to her feet, but her long legs buckled, and her stockings slipped down on her legs, and she spread out on the floor again till the tops of her stockings and her garters showed. The two of them smelled worse than the jail. They smelled just like what they were, a couple of drunks whose stomachs had been injected with what it is the body makes when it feels cold and full of booze and knows something bad has happened and doesn't want tomorrow to come. Neither one ever looked at me, and he never spoke. She said, "Take me home." I said, "That's why I'm here." She said, "Take him too." She was as beautiful a dancer as he was a flycaster. I carried her with her toes dragging behind her. Paul turned and without seeing or speaking followed. His overdeveloped right wrist held his right hand over his eyes so that in some drunken way he thought I could not see him, and he may also have thought that he could not see himself. As we went by the desk, the sergeant said, "Why don't you all go fishing?" I did not take Pearl. I did not take Paul's girl to her home. In those days, Indians who did not live on reservations had to live out by the city limits, and generally they pitched camp near either the slaughterhouse or the city dump. I took them back to Paul's apartment. I put him in his bed, and I put her in the bed where I had been sleeping. but not until I had changed it so that the fresh sheets would feel smooth to her legs. As I covered her, she said, "He should have killed the bastard." I said, "Maybe he did." Whereupon she rolled over and went to sleep, believing as she always did anything I told her, especially if it involved heavy casualties. By then, dawn was coming out of a mountain across the Missouri, so I drove to Wolf Creek. In those days, it took about an hour to drive the 40 miles of rough road from Helena to Wolf Creek. And while the sun came out of the Big Belt Mountains in the Missouri and left them behind in light, I tried to find something that I already knew about life that might help me reach out and touch my brother and get him to look at me and himself. For a while, I even thought what the desk sergeant first told me was useful. As a desk sergeant, he had to know a lot about life, and he had told me Paul was the Scottish equivalent of Black Irish. Without doubt, in my father's family, there were Black Scots occupying various outposts all the way from the original family home on the Isle of Mull in the southern Hebrides to Fairbanks, Alaska, 110 or 115 miles south of the Arctic Circle, which is about as far as a Scot could go then to get out of range of sheriffs with warrants and husbands with shotguns. I learned about them from my aunts, not my uncles, who were all Masons and believed in secret societies for males. My aunts, though, talked gaily about them and told me they were all big men and funny and had been wonderful to them when they were little girls. From my uncle's letters, it was clear that they still thought of my aunts as little girls. Every Christmas until they died in distant lands, these hastily departed brothers sent their once little sisters loving Christmas cards scrawled with assurances that they would soon return to the States and help them hang stockings on Christmas Eve. Seeing that I was relying on women to explain to myself what I didn't understand about men, I remembered a couple of girls I had dated who had uncles with some resemblances to my brother. The ranchers were fairly expert at some art that was really a hobby. One uncle was a watercolorist, and the other the club champion golfer, and each had selected a profession that would allow him to spend most of his time at his hobby. Both were charming, but you didn't quite know what, if anything, you knew when you had finished talking to them. Since they did not earn enough money from business to make life a hobby, their families had to meet from time to time with the county attorney to keep things quiet. Sunrise is the time to feel that you will be able to find out how to help somebody close to you who you think needs help, even if he doesn't think so. Sunrise, everything is luminous but not clear. Then, about 12 miles before Wolf Creek, the road drops into the little prickly pear canyon where dawn is long in coming. In the suddenly returning semi-darkness, I watched the road carefully, saying to myself, hell, my brother is not like anybody else. He's not my gal's uncle or a brother of my aunt's. He is my brother and an artist, and when a 4.5 ounce rod is in his hand, he is a major artist. He doesn't piddle around with paintbrush or take lessons to improve his short game, and he won't take money even when he must need it. He won't run anywhere from anyone, least of all the Arctic Circle, and it is a shame I do not understand him. Yet even in the loneliness of the canyon, I knew there were others like me who had brothers they did not understand but wanted to help. We are probably those referred to as our brother's keepers, possessed of one of the oldest and possibly one of the most futile and certainly one of the most haunting of instincts. It will not let us go. When I drove out of the canyon, it was ordinary daylight. I went to bed and had no trouble not going to sleep until my wife called me. Don't forget, Jesse said, you're going with Florence and me to meet Neil at the train. Oh God. The truth was I had forgotten, but when I thought about him, I felt relieved. It was good to remember that there was someone in my wife's family they worried about. And it was even better to remember to me he was a little bit funny. I was in need of relief, and comic relief seemed about as good as any. My wife kept standing at the door, waiting for me to roll over and try to go to sleep again. To her surprise, I jumped out of bed, started dressing. It will be a pleasure, I told her. Jessie said to me, you're funny. And I asked, what's funny about me? And Jessie said, I know you don't like him. I said, I do not like him, saying do not instead of don't, in case my voice was blurred and waking up. Jessie said, you're funny. Closed the door, then opened a crack of it and said, you are not funny. And my wife's not was also distinct. He was last off the train, and he came down the platform trying to remember what he thought an international cup tennis player looked like. He undoubtedly was the first and last passenger ever to step off a Great Northern coach at Wolf Creek, Montana, wearing white flannels and two sweaters. All this was in the days when the fancy Dans wore red, white, and blue tennis sweaters, and he had a red, white, and blue V-neck sweater over a red, white, and blue turtleneck sweater. When he recognized us as relatives and realized that he wouldn't be Bill Tilden or F. Scott Fitzgerald, he put down his suitcase and said, "Oh," except when he saw me, he said nothing. Then he turned his profile and waited to be kissed while the women took turns. I had a good look at his suitcase. It rested next to his elegant black and white shoes, and its straw sides had started to break open, and one of its locks did not lock. Between its handles were the initials FM, his mother's initials before she had married. When his mother saw the suitcase, she cried. So he came home with about what he had when he left Montana, because he still had his mother's suitcase and his own conception of himself as a Davis Cup player, which had first come to the surface in Wolf Creek, where you couldn't jump over a net without landing in cactus. It's good. It was not until 8:30 or 9 that night when that he tried to reduce himself in size so he could squeeze out of the door without being seen, but Florence and Jessie were waiting for him. My wife was barren of double talk, so to avoid being told, I got up and accompanied him to Black Jack's bar, sometimes, although rarely, called a tavern. Black Jack's was a freight car taken off its wheels and set on gravel at the other end of the bridge crossing the Little Prickly Pear. And on the other side of the boxcar was the sign of the Great Northern Railroad, a mountain goat gazing through a white beard on a world painted red. This is the only goat that ever saw the bottom of his world constantly occupied by a bottle of bar whiskey labeled 3777, the number of the vigilantes pinned on the first road agents they hanged in order to represent probably the dimensions of a grave. The numbers are thought to mean 3 feet wide, 7 feet long, and 77 inches deep. The bar was a log split in two by someone who wasn't much good with it, with an axe, maybe Blackjack himself, but his customers had done a much better job in greasing it with their elbows. Blackjack was short, trembled, and never got far from a revolver and a blackjack, but lay behind the greased log. His teeth were bad, probably the result of drinking his own whiskey, which was made somewhere up Sheep Gulch. The stools in front of the bar were reconstructed grocery crates. When Neil and I walked in, two of the crates were occupied, both by characters long familiar to the Great Northern Goat. On the first was a bar character called Longbow, because in this once Indian country, anyone making an art of telling big lies about his hunting and shooting was said to pull the longbow. Having seen him shoot once, though, I myself never acted on the assumption that he lied about what he could do with firearms. I had seen a friend of his throw 5 aspirin tablets in the air, which bloomed into 5 small white flowers immediately following 5 shots that sounded like one. I was just as sure he could challenge the champion sheepherder of the Sebin Ranch at his own game. The Sebin Ranch is one of the finest in western Montana, spreading all the way from the Helena Valley to Lincoln and beyond, and its owners, Gene and John Bacchus, tell about a favorite sheepherder they once had to take to the hospital, where his condition rapidly changed for the worse. They couldn't get his underwear off. It had been on him so long his hair had grown through it. Finally, they had to pluck. God, finally they had to pluck him like a chicken. And when his underwear finally came off, pieces of skin came with it. At the opening of Longbow's shirt, which wasn't buttoned for quite a way down, you could see hair sprouting out of his underwear. On the crate at the other end of the bar was a female character known as Old Rawhide to the goats up and down the Great Northern Line. About 10 years before, at a 4th of July celebration, she'd been elected Beauty Queen of Wolf Creek. She had ridden bareback, standing up through the 111 inhabitants, mostly male, who had lined one of Wolf Creek's two streets. Her skirts flew high and she won the contest, but since she didn't quite have what it takes to become a professional rider, she did the next best thing. However, she still wore the divided skirts of a Western horsewoman of the day, although they must have been a handicap in her new profession. For a small town, Wolf Creek loomed large upon the map. It had almost two national celebrities, one a steer wrestler and the other a fancy roper. These two local artists spent their summers at county fairs and were good enough to come out $500 or $600 ahead of the season, less, of course, their hospital expenses. Old Rawhide did not intend to spend the rest of her life as a disappointed athlete, so she would shack up one winter with the fancy roper and the next winter with the steer wrestler. Occasionally in late autumn, when it looked as if it were going to be an especially hard winter, she would marry one of them. But marriage wasn't Old Rawhide's natural state of bliss, and before spring, she would be shacked up with the other one. Shacking up brought out Old Rawhide's most enduring and durable quality, and unlike marriage, could be counted on to last all winter. In the summers, while her artists were living off hot dogs at county fairs and rupturing their intestines while twisting the necks of steers, Old Rawhide inhabited Blackjack's bar, reduced to picking up stray fishermen, most of them bait and hardware fishermen from Great Falls. So for her, as for the rest of the world, life had its ups and downs. However, she didn't allow much of the effects of life's gravitational pulls. Like many fancy riders, she was rather small and very tough and very strong, especially in the legs. She had weathered enough to deserve her name, but she didn't look much older than her 30 years spent mostly with horses and horsemen and the sporting element of Great Falls. Even when she and Longbow were at the bar, they sat at opposite ends so that itinerant fishermen had to sit between them and buy the drinks. That's where Neil and I, that's where Neil and I sat when we came in. Hi, Longbow, Neil said, and Over shook his hand. Longbow did not like to be called Longbow, although he knew he was called Longbow behind his back. But to Neil, he was just plain old Longbow, and after a couple of shots of 3777, Neil was out shooting, out hunting, and out trapping the government trapper. There's something deep in Neil that compelled him to lie to experts, even though they knew best that he was lying. He was one of those who need to be caught off telling a lie while he's telling it. As for Old Rawhide, Neil hadn't looked at her yet. I was already wise to the fact that Neil's opening ploy with women was to ignore them, and indeed was beginning to recognize what a good opening it is. The mirror behind the bar looked like a polished Precambrian mudstone with ripples on it. Neil watched it constantly, evidently fascinated by the dark, distorted image of himself, living automatically, buying all the drinks and doing all the talking, and none of the listening. I tried to break the monopoly by talking to Old Rawhide, who was sitting next to me, but she was aware only of being ignored, so she ignored me. Finally, I listened. Since no one would listen to me, although I didn't go so far as to buy the drinks, Neil had trailed an otter and her pups up to Rogers Pass, where the thermometer officially recorded 69.7 degrees below zero. And while he trailed that otter, I tried to trace its lineage from his description of it. I had a hard time following it, he said, because it had turned white in the winter, so it must have been part ermine. After he treated her, he said she stretched out on the lower branch, ready to pounce on the first deer that came along, so she had to have a strain of mountain lion in her. So she also must have been part otter because she was jokey and smiled at him, but mostly she was 3777. because she was the only animal in western Montana besides man that had pups in the winter. They snuggled up right in my shirt, he said, showing us a shirt under his two red and red, white, and blue sweaters. Longbow gently tapped the thick bottom of his empty glass on the bar, without saying a word for fear of appearing inattentive. But old Rawhide couldn't stand the silent treatment any longer. No matter what, she leaned in front of me and said to the side of Neil's face, "Hey, Buster, what are otters doing on top of the Continental Divide? I thought otters swam in creeks and played on mudslides." Neil stopped in the middle of a sentence and stared at the mirror, trying to pick out the distortion other than his own which had spoken. "Let's have another drink," he said to all the distortions. Then, for the first time, he formally recognized that a woman was present by looking not at the image, but at the reality of Blackjack behind the bar and saying, "Give her one too." Old Rawhide closed her hand, and when the drink was put in it, but kept on staring at Neil's profile. In the ranch town of Wolf Creek, she and the great northern goat had probably seen only a couple of other men who were pale and had sunken eyes. As I pushed myself out of my crate to keep my promise to go home early, Longbow said, "Thanks." Since I hadn't bought a drink all evening, I knew he must be thanking me for leaving them my brother-in-law. Even than my brother-in-law. The moment I rose from my crate, old Rawhide moved into it to be closer to Neil. She peered into his profile, and romance stirred romance stirred under her epidermis. On the way out, I said to Neil over my shoulder, "Don't forget, we're going fishing tomorrow morning." And he looked over her shoulder and said, "What?" Paul was in Wolf Creek early next morning, just as he said he would be. Although he and I acquired freedoms as we grew up, we never violated our early religious training of always being on time for church, work, and fishing. Florence met him at the door and said nervously, "I'm sorry, Paul, but Neil isn't up yet. He got home late." Paul said, "I didn't even go to bed last night. Get him up, Florence." She said, "He isn't very well." He said, "Neither am I, but I'm going fishing in a few minutes." They stared at each other. No Scottish mother likes to be caught with a lazy son in bed, and no Scots going fishing likes, and no Scot going fishing likes to stand around waiting for a male relative with a hangover. Although the Scots invented whiskey, they try not to acknowledge the existence of hangovers, especially within the family circle. Normally, it would have been no better than a standoff between my brother and my mother-in-law. But in this rare case, a Scottish lady couldn't think of a thing to say in her son's defense, so she had to wake him up, although as little as possible. We slowly loaded the half-ton truck that belonged to Kinney, my one brother-in-law who had remained in Wolf Creek. The three women had already covered the shady end of the box with an old mattress, and then they covered the mattress with their with their relative from the West Coast. After space had been found for the potato salad, the grill, and our fishing tackle, 6 of us tried to be comfortable without in any way disturbing the mattress. All but the first 3 miles of the road to the Elkhorn parallels the Missouri as it emerges from the gigantic opening that Lewis and Clark called the gateway to the mountains. Although the water remains clear for a few miles further down, the earth itself turns tawny almost the moment the river pours out of the mountains. It's just below the dark opening where the Elkhorn empties into the Missouri that the road ends. Like most dirt roads paralleling the Missouri, it's mostly gray dust and chuck holes. The chuck holes did not improve Neil's health, and the gray dust would turn to gumbo if it rained. Kenny, as one of Jesse's brothers who stayed in Wolf Creek, was was like most who live in towns with 2 streets. He could do hardly anything with his hands. Among other things, he could drive a half-ton truck over country where it would be hard to take a pack mule, and he had married Dorothy, a registered nurse. She was short and powerful and had been trained as a surgical nurse. Ranchers holding their intestines in their hands would ride in from the back country looking for the RN to sew them together again. Florence and Jesse were also medical in varying degrees, and the three of them were thought of as the medical center, the medical center of Wolf Creek. Now the three women bent over an old mattress, constituting, as it were, the intensive care unit. Ken was friendly with all 111 inhabitants of Wolf Creek and most of the ranchers in the surrounding country, especially with the ranchers from Scotland who had come to the west early, knowing ahead of time how to raise cattle in mountains and snow. That's how he got permission to fish in the Elkhorn. Jim McGregor owned it to its headwaters, and every fence was posted reading from top to bottom, no hunting, no fishing, and finally, as an afterthought, no trespassing. As a result, he furnished pasture for about as many elk as cows, but he figured this was cheaper than opening his range to hunters from Great Falls who have difficulty telling an elk from a cow. One thing about a ranch road, there is less and less of it the closer it gets to the cows. It became just two ruts that made switchbacks to the top of a ridge, and then it repeated roughly the same number down to the Elkhorn, which is just a curve of willows and water, winding through high grass until suddenly a mountain opens and the willows disappear. At the top of the ridge, the ruts were still made of gray dust, and black clouds rested upon the black mountains ahead. Paul was out of the truck as soon as it stopped at the creek bottom. He had his rod up and his leader and flies on before I could free myself from the vice in which I'd been sitting between Dorothy and Jessie, who had been holding me tight by the soft part of the arm and muttering, "Don't you run off and leave my brother." Besides, I had to hop around for a minute or so because a leg had gone to sleep in the vise. By that time, Paul was saying behind his back, "I'll walk 3 fishing distances down and then fish upstream. You spread out and fish downstream until we meet." Then he was gone. One reason Paul caught more fish than anyone else was that he had his flies in the water more than anyone else. "Brother," he would say, "there are no flying fish in Montana. Out here you can't catch fish with your flies in the air." His outfit was set up ready to go the moment he stepped out of the car. He walked fast. He seldom wasted time changing flies, but instead changed the depth he was fishing them or the motion with which he retrieved them. If he did change flies, he tied knots with the speed of a seamstress, and so on. His flies were in the water at least 20% more of the time than mine. I guess there was also another reason why today he was separating himself from me as fast and as far as possible. He did not want to talk. He did not want me to talk to him about the other night. Ken said he would go upstream to fish the beaver dams. He liked beaver dams and he knew how to fish them, so off he went happily to wade in the ooze and to get throttled by brush and to fall through loose piles of sticks called beaver dams and end up with a wreath of seaweed around his neck and a basket full of fish. Jessie gave me another pinch on the arm and shortened her warning to, "Don't leave my brother." Rubbing my arm, I made him go first so he couldn't escape immediately. We went down the trail around the first bend where the creek comes out of osiers and crosses a meadow. Then his steps faltered and he became intentionally pitiful. "I'm still not well," he said. "I think I'll stop here and fish the meadow." Because of the bend in the creek, he couldn't be seen, and yet if he walked back, he would have only a couple of 100 yards to go. "Why not?" I asked, already knowing a foolish question when I asked one. Even though Paul must have had 3 or 4 fish by now, I took my time walking down the trail, trying with each step to leave the world behind. Something within fishermen tries to make fishing into a world perfect and apart. I don't know what it is or where, because sometimes it is in my arms and sometimes in my throat and sometimes nowhere in particular except somewhere deep. Many of us probably would be better fishermen if we did not spend so much time watching and waiting for the world to become perfect. The hardest thing usually to leave behind was, as was the case now, can loosely be called the conscience. Should or shouldn't I speak to my brother about what happened the other night? I have referred to it vaguely as what happened the other night, so as not to visualize it, especially not the casting hand. Shouldn't I at least offer to help him with money if he has to pay damages? I thought about these old questions in new forms, now framed by long, dancing legs spread out on a jail floor until finally the question of conscience disappeared. Again, as usual, without any answers to them. I still didn't know whether I had resolved to talk to my brother today. However, I still kept worrying about something, whatever it was, until I turned around in the trail and went back to the meadow so I could say that I had. Across the meadow was a dam, and above it a big blue hole where Neil sat nodding on a rock. The Red Hills Brothers, the Red Hills Brothers coffee can beside him. His neck was bowed, pale, exposed to the sun, and soon to match the coffee can. What are you doing? I asked. It took him some time to arrange an answer. I have been fishing, he said finally. Then he tried over again for greater accuracy. I have been fishing and not feeling well, he said. This dead water isn't much of a place to fish, is it? I asked. Why, he said, look at all those fish at the bottom of the hole. Those are squawfish and suckers, I told him without looking. What's a sucker? He asked. What's a sucker? He asked, and so became the first native of Montana ever to sit on a rock and ask what a sucker was. In the deep water below him was a little botch of pink that was sure to be angleworms with one hook running through all their guts. On the leader, oh God, on the leader just above the worms were two red beads, strung there no doubt for cosmetic purposes. The botch of angleworms and the two beads hung within 6 inches of the nearest sucker. Not a fish stirred, and neither did the fishermen, although both were in plain view of each other. Would you like to go fishing sometime with Paul and me? I asked. Thanks, he said, but not just now. Well, then, I said, take care of yourself and have a good time. I am, he said. I walked down the trail again under the mistaken notion I might have done myself some good by going back to see my brother-in-law. However, that big cloud coming out of the entrance to the Rocky Mountains kept telling me that much as I was looking for moments of perfection, I wasn't going to find any today, and also that I wasn't going to catch many fish unless I quit fooling around. I turned off the trail at the next meadow and could have caught my limit in 2 or 3 holes. Because Jim McGregor allowed only a few fishermen a year on this small creek, it was overpopulated with fish that would probably never grow longer than 10 or 11 inches. I had only one problem in catching them, and it lasted for only the first few fish. I was too fast in setting the hook. There's a barb on the end of the hook, and unless the hook gets embedded in the fish's mouth or jaw deep enough to set the barb in it, the fish spits or tears the hook out. So, as the fish strikes, the line has to be given a little jerk, either directly with the left hand or with the rod in the right hand. The timing and the pressure have to be perfect. Too soon or too late or too little or too much, and the fish may have a sore mouth for a few days, but will probably live longer for his experience. I was setting the fly so fast I was taking it away from the fish before he could get a hold of it. Every different kind of trout is on a different speedometer, and the correct timing will vary also with the stream and even the weather and time of day. And I had been fishing too long in the fast water of the big Blackfoot, where big rainbows charge out from behind the fortresses of big rocks. Some early rancher had planted the elkhorn with eastern brook trout, and as the name suggests, they're a more meditative type. Once I got my, once I got my timing slowed down, I lost interest in them. They are beautiful to see. Black backs, yellow and orange spots on their sides, red bellies, ending in underfins fringed with white. They are compositions and colors and were often painted on platters, but they are only fairly good fighters and they feel like eels because their scales are so small. Because their name is against, because besides their name is against them in western Montana, where the word brook is not a socially acceptable substitute for creek. All of a sudden, I wondered what my brother was doing because I knew he certainly wasn't wasting time catching his limit of 10-inch eastern brook trout. If I wanted to stay in shooting distance of him, I had better start trying to catch some of these brown monsters that work their way up from the Missouri. Fishing is a world created apart from all others, and inside it are special worlds of their own. One is fishing for big fish in small water where there's not enough world and water to accommodate a fish and a fisherman, and the willows on the side of the creek are all against the fisherman. I stopped, cleaned my eastern brook trout, and arranged them in my basket between layers of wild hay and mint where they were more beautiful than those painted on the platters. Then, in preparation for big game, I changed to an 8-pound test leader and to a number 6 fly. I waxed the first 30 feet of my line in case it had become water soaked and would not float, took one final look at my 10-inch eastern brook trout line and mint, and then closed my basket on a world of small fish. The huge shadow met me coming across the meadow with one big cloud behind it. The Elkhorn Canyon is so deep and narrow that a black cloud or a cloud and a half can constitute the sky. The black cloud and a half can pass on to sunshine or it can make room for blacker clouds. From the bottom of the canyon, there is no way of seeing what is coming, but I had a feeling it wasn't sunshine. Suddenly, so many fish began to jump that it looked as if the first extra large raindrops had arrived. When fish start jumping like this, something is happening to the weather. At that moment, the world was totally composed of the elkhorn, a mythological brown trout, the weather, and me, and all that existed of me were thoughts about the elkhorn, the weather, and a mythological fish that may have been a fingerling in my imagination. The elkhorn looks just like what it was, a crack in the earth to mark where the Rocky Mountains and the Great Basin begin. The giant mountains are black-backed, with nearly the last of mountain pines. Their eastern sides turn brown and yellow as the tall prairie grasses begin, but there are occasional black spots where the pines scatter themselves out to get a last look back. The mythological brown trout and the canyon harmonized in my thoughts. The trout that might be real and close at hand was massive, black on the back, yellow and brown on the sides, had black spots and final fringe of white. The elkhorn and the brown trout are also like in being beautiful by being partly ugly. I walked past 150 or 200 yards of water where little brookies were still bouncing like rain and came finally to a beautiful stretch with not a fish jumping in it. At the head of the hole, the water parted on a big rock, swirled backwards, deepened, deposited, and finally lost depth and motion by drifting under oysters. I thought it can't be that no fish jumps in such beautiful water because no fish is in it. It must be one fish is there so big he is like a bull elk with a royal head that his rutting season runs all the male contenders out of the herd. Since it is generally better to fish creeks upstream so water to be fished next is not dirty, I stepped back on shore where the fish couldn't see me and walked to the lower end of the hole before making my first cast. By then I had lost faith in my theory about the one bull elk in the hole, but I did expect to pick up a brookie or two in the shallow water. When I didn't create a stir, I moved upstream to deeper water where the oysters began and bugs dropped off them. Not even a glitter in the water from the side of a trout that started for the fly and suddenly decided that something looked wrong. I began to wonder if somebody had thrown a stick of dynamite into the hole and blown all the fish belly up along with my one bull elk theory. If there was one fish in all this water, there was only one place left for him to be. If he wasn't in the open water, and if he wasn't around the edges of the osiers, that he had to be under the osiers, and I wasn't happy about the prospect of casting into willow bushes. Years ago, at the end of a summer that I had worked in the Forest Service, I was fishing with Paul, and being out of practice, I was especially careful to keep in open water. Paul watched me fish a hole and went under willows until he couldn't bear the that went under willows until he couldn't bear the sight any longer. Brother, he said, you can't catch trout in a bathtub. You like to fish in sunny open water because you are a Scot and afraid to lose a fly if you cast into the bushes. But the fish are not taking sun baths. They're under the bushes, where it is cool and safe from fishermen like you. I only supported his charges of defending myself. I lose flies when I get mixed up in the bushes, I complained. What the hell do you care? He said. We don't pay for flies. George is always glad to tie more for us. Nobody, he said, has put in a good day's fishing unless he leaves a couple of flies hanging on the bushes. You can't fish if you don't dare go where they are. Let me have your rod, he said. I suppose he took my rod so I wouldn't think that the cast into the bushes would be done only by his rod. It was in this way that I came to know that my rod can be made to cast into bushes. But the truth is, I have never mastered the cast, probably because I still flinch from the prospect of losing flies that I don't have to pay for. I had no choice now but to cast into those willows if I wanted to know why fish were jumping in the water all around me, except in this hole. And I still wanted to know because it is not fly fishing if you're not looking for answers to questions. Since I hadn't used this cast for some time, I decided to practice up a bit, so I dropped downstream to make a few casts into the bushes. Then I walked cautiously upstream to where the oysters were thickest, watching my feet and not rattling any rocks. The cast was high and soft when it went by my head, the opposite of what it would have been if it was being driven into the wind. I was excited but kept my arm cool and under my control. Instead of putting on power as the line started forward, I let it float on until the vertical periscope in my eye or brain or arm or whatever it is told me my fly was over the edge of the nearest oysters. Then I put a check cast into the line and it began to drop almost straight down. 10 or 15 feet before the fly lights, you can tell whether a cast like this is going to be perfect and, if necessary, still make slight corrections. The cast is so soft and slow that it can be followed like an ash settling from a fireplace chimney. One of life's quiet excitements is to stand somewhere apart from yourself and watch yourself softly becoming the author of something beautiful, even if it is only a floating ash. The leader settled on the lowest branch of the bush, and the fly swung on its little pendulum 3 or 4 inches from the water, or maybe it was 5 or 6. To complete the cast, I was supposed next to shake the line with my rod, so if the line wasn't caught in the bush, the fly would drop into the water underneath. I may have done this, or maybe the fish blew out of the water and took my fly as it soared up the bush. It is the only time I have ever fought a fish in a tree. Indians used to make baskets out of the red branches of osiers, so there was no chance the branches would break. It was fish or fishermen. Something odd, detached, and even slightly humorous happens to a big fish fisherman a moment after a big fish strikes. In the arm, shoulder, or brain of a big fish fisherman is a scale. And the moment the big fish goes in the air, the big fish fisherman, no matter what his blood pressure is, places the scale under the fish and coolly weighs him. He doesn't have hands and arms enough to do all the other things he should be doing at the same time, but he tries to be fairly exact about the weight of the fish so he won't be disappointed when he catches him. I said to myself, this son of a bitch weighs 7 or 8 pounds. And I tried to allow for the fact that I might be weighing part of the bush. The air was filled with dead leaves and green berries from the oysters, but their branches held as the big brown went up the bush. He tied a different knot on every branch. He passed. He wove that bush into a basket with square knots, bow lines, and double half hitches. The body and spirit suffer no more sudden visitation than that of losing a big fish, since, after all, there must be some slight transition between life and death. But with a big fish, one moment the world is nuclear, and the next it has disappeared. That's all. It is gone. The fish is gone, and you are extinct except for 4.5 ounces of stick to which is tied some line, and a semi-transparent thread of catgut to which is tied a little curved piece of Swedish steel to which is tied a part of a feather from a chicken's neck. I don't even know which way he went. As far as I know, he may have gone right up on the bush and disappeared into thin air. I waded out to the bush to see if any signs of reality had been left behind. There was some fishing tackle strung around, but my hands trembled, so I couldn't untie the complicated knots that wove into the branches. Even Moses could not have trembled more when his bush blew upon him. Finally, I tied my line from the leader and left the rest of the mess in the willows. Poets talk about spots of time, but it's really fishermen who experience eternity compressed into a moment. No one can tell what a spot of time is until suddenly the whole world is a fish and the fish is gone. I shall remember that son of a bitch forever. Okay, I'm off.